Do you have any ideas on who did it?
She asked Kamakura-kun as the students morosely investigated, a dark cloud visibly hanging over them. Chiaki had played her share of mystery games and was compulsively piecing together the different clues in her head. But it was hard when she couldn't investigate herself and had to go off what Naegi-kun was seeing. Not to mention still being shaken by what she'd just seen, the deaths of 2 young women her age. For some reason, the scars on her torso had ached, seeing what happened to Not Enoshima. I have already deduced who the killer was, yes. Then, rather than saying who, he turned and fixed her with his sharp gaze. Tell me, Nanami, do you believe Naegi Makoto killed Meizono Sayaka?
No.
She interlocked her fingers together, dropping them onto her lap.
I won't deny I thought he might have for a moment, when they said the crime scene was his room. But looking at how hard he's working, and at some of the evidence itself, no. More than that, I don't believe he would kill someone he cared about.
You have no evidence to support that belief. Her lips twisted into a wry smile.
I've told you before, haven't I? There's no logic to believing in someone. I just rely on what my heart's saying.
Then who do you think the culprit is?
Kuwata-kun. Those English numbers Maizono-san left as a dying message, if you flip them upside down, they spell out his given name.
Something she'd only recognized because Pokemon's unknown alphabet had a basis in English. She'd been thinking 11 and 0 looked like N and O, and had tried to figure out what N037 could mean. Then she'd thought that if the first 2 were letters, maybe the others were too, and after a bit of struggling, found the answer.
I'm just not sure how he was able to get in the room.
Kamakura-kun did not answer, and all conversation ceased completely. They stayed that way for the rest of the investigation, until finally, Monokuma announced it was time for the students to gather at a set of red doors on the first floor. Breaking away from his talk with Fujisaki-san, Naegi-kun hurried through the halls to the appointed place. Goosebumps rose on Chiaki's skin as he drew closer to the doors, sickeningly familiar. He pushed them open, and the gamer's blood ran cold when she saw what lay beyond. An elevator, the doors sliding open with a cheerful ding. And suddenly the arms around her tightened in a squeeze, like a farewell, before shoving her. Caught off guard, she stumbled and fell, her elbow banging painfully against the floor. Blinking back tears of pain and shock, she turned, wanting to ask what was happening, and Naegi-kun was walking to the other students as they piled in, pleading innocent, but his words were nothing to Chiaki's ears, just meaningless syllables.
That's why you were chosen.
Yukizome-sensei breathed, smiling coldly. Her breath was coming up rapid and shallow. From the corner of her eye, she saw Kamakura-kun's head turn sharply towards her as she hunched over, hands gripping her shivering arms. The door slammed shut in front of her teacher's face. The camera followed the elevator down. It was dark and the metallic rattling was loud, and she was too stunned to move as it began its descent. All she could think was,
Sumiki-san! Yukizome-sensei! Why?
There was pain in her arm from where she'd landed on it wrong, but it seemed inconsequential compared to the pain in her heart. Her throat was too clogged by betrayal to speak. All she could do was stare up at the rapidly shrinking image of her teacher as the elevator carted her off into darkness. Nanami. Memories of Sumiki-san's apologetic face, the crazed look in Yukizome-sensei's eyes floated before her. She didn't understand why they'd done this, and she could only ask their phantoms, uncomprehending.
Why?
Nanami. Eventually, she managed to get herself into a sitting position. She didn't dare try to stand. Her legs felt like jelly, and the elevator was shaking so much. Her heart pounded faster and faster, trying to escape out of her chest. Her tongue was heavy and dry in her mouth. Nanami. It was pitch black. She couldn't see anything. It was just her, and the darkness, and the rattling. Was gone. Slowly, the gloom around her melted into the blurry image of a living room? She blinked once, twice, to make sure it wouldn't disappear. Somehow, she'd ended up on the floor, curled into the fetal position, her toes dug into the tatami, a feeble anchor. The TV was turned off. Kamakura-kun was crouching in front of her, watching her. He stayed a good distance away, and once he saw he had her attention, spoke lowly and carefully, like he was talking to a frightened animal. It is March. You are not in Enoshima's domain. You are in the mountains with me. We were just watching the Killing Game broadcast. You are safe. Repeat it. His words broached the haze around her. It was like surfacing from too long underwater, and she gasped harshly.
It's March.
Not September.
I'm not in Enoshima's domain. I'm in the mountains with you. We were watching the Killing Game broadcast. I'm
safe. 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 Safe.
I'm safe.
Still speaking in that tone, he asked, "What did you flash back to?" Chiaki squeezed her eyes shut.
Elevator.
She croaked.
I was with Yukizome-sensei at the elevator. She pushed me in.
Saying the words brought the memories squirming back to the forefront of her mind, wriggling like maggots, and she whimpered. The tears clinging to the edges of her eyelashes spilled over. You were triggered by the sight of the elevator Class 78 entered. That is all. It was not real. You are not back there. His words bumped together in her brain meaninglessly until eventually they fumbled into place.
Elevators are a trigger for me?
They had been keeping an eye out for triggers, and found one in dungeon crawlers with a first-person perspective, like the Wizardy series. Losing that had sucked. She'd really liked that series. But though he'd taught her some strategies to cope with it, they hadn't known about elevators, and discovering a trigger so suddenly had left her unprepared to use those methods. Her body shook, head throbbing, as she tried to focus on the here and now. Do you want water? She shook her head. Do you want your rabbit? She nodded. Chiaki pried her eyes open and stared straight ahead at his legs as they rose and moved out of view. A few moments later, they returned. Nanami, you need to uncurl to hold her. Slowly, she did. Just a little. Just enough for there to be room. Yumigami's soft brown form was deposited into the slim space between her torso and her legs, and she burrowed her face into her fur. Yumigami was warm and alive and safe. Her heartbeat began to slow down, but she still couldn't stop trembling. Kamakura-kun ran a detached eye over her. You still seem distressed. Further physical contact is likely necessary. Are you all right with that? Was he asking permission to touch her? Her first instinct was to flinch away, because he would be close, and Yukizome-sensei had been close, and she'd been pushed. But it was Kamakura-kun.
Okay.
She whispered. Even so, she instinctively tensed as he sat down beside her. His hand hovered in the air as if he were deciding what to do with it before it extended and wrapped around her shoulders. She closed her eyes and pressed closer into Kamakura-kun's side, relishing the weight of his arm around her and his warmth and the sound of his heartbeat. At that moment, she felt incredibly protected, like nothing could ever get to her here, and she honestly would not have minded staying in his arms forever.
It's okay. I'm safe. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay.
In the end, they missed the first trial. Her flashback had only lasted a minute or two, but it took an hour before she was mentally sound again. And she just had not wanted to deal with the killing game. So, she and Kamakura-kun played silly, non-violent video games for the rest of the day. Chiaki felt awful, weak, and ashamed when she woke up the next morning and realized the entire class might have died. She was beyond relieved when Kamakura-kun carefully turned the TV on and they saw the class doing a radio exercise at the gym.
Thank goodness. They solved it. I guess it was Kawada-kun after all.
The redhead was conspicuously absent from the assembled students. She hoped his death, because what else could punishment have meant, had been swift. Correct. And then Kamakura-kun laid out the most probable sequence of events. How Meizono-san most likely wasn't just a hapless victim, but an attempted killer herself. How she'd probably been the one to take the knife from the kitchen. How she'd lured Kawada-kun in, planning to kill him, and frame Naegi-kun for it, only to be slain by her intended victim. As I said, she was only using Naegi, he concluded. Chiaki shook her head.
No. I don't believe that's true. She left that dying message, didn't she? Surely. She must have felt remorse and wanted to save Naegi-kun.
There are other explanations for that. Spite, for one.
True. And we can't really ask her, so I guess we'll never know for sure.
She smiled, a bit sadly, and placed a hand over her heart.
But I still choose to believe she was acting with good intentions. Because humans are pretty complicated. Even if she was using him, it doesn't mean she never cared.
He did not respond, and in somberness, they went back to watching the broadcast. End of Chapter 13. Author's note. You might think it odd Chiaki gets triggered by elevators and not the specific phrase, punishment time, but triggers can be anything, really, even something as apparently inoffensive as cologne. And since getting pushed in that elevator is what sealed her fate, it seemed likely to me she'd subconsciously associate them with danger. I tried to recap the game's events quickly, since y'all know what happened already, so there's no point in boring you with exposition, while still offering perspective. Hopefully that worked.